Thank you, Eileen. Thank you for inviting me here. It's quite a it's actually a really moving visit that I've experienced already here. I should say that the institution that I teach at, Drury University, is in Springfield, Missouri. So even if I knew nothing whatsoever about Lincoln or Lincoln's background, I've had the dubious experience of encountering Springfield, Illinois multiple times when guests that I've brought to the university have had their luggage rerouted here instead of Springfield, Missouri. I don't know if you all know Oliver Sacks, the wonderful writer and neurobiologist. He came to Drury once. I picked him up at the airport, and his luggage was here. And I said, "Well, is that going to be a big problem?" And he said, "Well, my tuxedo's in that luggage." So he managed to appear in his shorts and T-shirt instead of a tuxedo. More seriously, a couple things come to mind. First of all, it is we're very close to the 150th anniversary of Shiloh. And that battle, as I'm sure many of you know, in many ways told Americans that the Civil War was going to be different than they had initially expected it to be. The scope, the scale, the sheer numbers of casualties, the beginning sense that this was going to be a war of attrition, all signal the importance and characterize Shiloh as the first modern battle. And in 2 days we will be commemorating that battle. I've never been to the Lincoln Museum before, and what a truly wonderful experience it was to go through the various exhibits and to see that those exhibits have been designed in many ways from a literary perspective and not just a historical perspective. And what I mean by that is, and you undoubtedly know this, but that exhibit is wonderful for the way in which it is able to get into the psyche, it seems to me, of Lincoln at various points of his life, and to dramatize the conflicts that he experienced once he was elected, once the war starts, once he decides to sign the proclamation, the Emancipation Proclamation. So it's been a wonderful, if all too short, trip to Springfield so far. Lincoln is so fascinating to me, somebody who studies literature. Not just for the moral force that he was, or not just for the exemplary political tactician and strategist that he was, but also as a literary stylist, and also as one of the 19th century's great writers. And it's nice to be here and to discuss the way American literature and the Civil War interacted with one another in this place devoted to Lincoln, who, as much as anyone, knew that the Civil War was not only a war that involved artillery and minie-balls and companies of men from the North and South fighting one another, but it was also a war of words. It was, and in fact, the United States is in many ways a nation of words. If you think about it, those 5 great words that are in the Declaration of Independence: all men are created equal. The words that Lincoln used in the first inaugural, or in the Gettysburg Address, or in the second inaugural. Lincoln knew that in many ways the battle that was raging in places like Shiloh and Antietam and Fredericksburg was also a battle of ideas and a battle of words. And that was what I was interested in when I wrote my book. if you'll bear with me, I'd like to jump back about 33 years to before the start of the Civil War, to the year 1828, when a British nobleman and essayist wrote an article with the title, "Who Reads an American Book?" He was not saying, "Hey, who reads an American book?" It was an ironic, sarcastic title. Who reads an American book? And the point that he lays out in this article, which was published in a prominent literary journal in Scotland and was read not only in the UK but also across the Atlantic in Boston and New York and Philadelphia. The point that he was trying to make was that the United States maybe had an interesting political system, and he was willing to concede that democracy was an interesting experiment. He wasn't willing to go so far as to say it was successful yet, but it was an interesting political experiment, but it had not yet yielded culture, in his estimation. It had not yet yielded a significant, rich literary culture the way England, for example, and not coincidentally, had created Shakespeare and Milton, or the way Italy had created a Dante. So his point was, whereas England, for example, had created a rich literature that suggested that there was something important in the life of the nation, the United States hadn't done that yet. And in fact, what the United States did was imitate England. When James Fenimore Cooper, for example, invented Natty Bumppo and The Last of the Mohicans and all of that, really what he was doing was just kind of Americanizing Sir Walter Scott. And Sidney Smith goes through a list of other American authors and basically makes that same point, that America is imitative and has not yet created its own literature, and therefore is a kind of second-class nation in a way. Sometimes my students have a hard time getting their mind around that, but I say, well, can you imagine another nation or culture that didn't have its own musical tradition or its own storytelling tradition? You would consider it in some way defective, and that was the point that Sidney Smith was making. That point was a shot across the bow for a number of American authors, especially in the New England portion of the country. By 1834 or so, a fellow named Ralph Waldo Emerson takes very seriously Sidney Smith's critique of American culture and begins to formulate and to theorize what an American literature might look like. Emerson's really, really interesting. He has, almost from the beginning, an idea that whatever American literature is going to look like, it's not going to look like British literature. The fact that we are a democracy and not, for example, a monarchy or a feudal-based system, the way the England of Chaucer or Shakespeare, for example, was, means that whatever writing occurs in this nation is going to be different. Also, another significant difference, the landscape. This vast, unbounded, seemingly endless frontier that that was certainly by no stretch settled in the 1830s, is something entirely different than the tidy agricultural land of England. And what Emerson does in response to Sidney Smith and in response to other critiques by the British is to formulate a kind of literature that is going to be based entirely upon the self. That is the common denominator of democracy. It is the individual citizen. Those of you who have read Self-Reliance, for example, in school will know that what Emerson is really interested in doing is saying that the independent individual self that experiences life in an unmediated way is going to be the creator of American literature. In Nature, his first book, written in 1836, he says, why cannot we also have an original relationship to the universe? In The American Scholar, written about 5 years later, he says, books are important to the scholar, but not nearly as important as nature and experience. And his idea is that whatever American literature is going to look like, it's not going to be involved with tidy poetic lines, for example. It's not going to have a tidy rhyme scheme. It's not going to be iambic pentameter. No, the American character, Emerson feels, is much more unbounded than that, is freer than that, does not need those kinds of constrictions. In an essay that he wrote entitled "The Poet," he says, I'm looking for not meters, but a meter-making argument." And again, what he means there is, I don't want somebody who can mimic John Milton or Dryden or Pope or even Wordsworth or Shelley. I want somebody who looks at the world with fresh eyes and describes it in whatever language comes to her or to him. That's the poetry that is going to change America. And Emerson, as you may know, influenced a very wide number of folks, from Emily Dickinson, who's writing reclusively in her father's house on the second floor, but who is writing poetry unlike any other poetry that had been written to that time. Or Henry David Thoreau, who takes Emerson's essays as a kind of mission statement and says, I'm going to go live on the banks of Walden Pond for 2 years and write about it. I'm going to separate myself from society. I'm going to separate myself from convention, and I'm going to try to live in an original way. There were some naysayers. Both Nathaniel Hawthorne and Herman Melville think that Emerson's faith in the individual to live without convention, without society, is a little naive. But even they are writing kind of in response to Emerson's ideas. The person that I thought I would talk a little bit about today, to give you an example of how the Civil War transformed American literature, is Walt Whitman. And I choose Whitman in part because of all of the writers that we considered classic from this period. His relationship with Lincoln was far and away the most, the deepest and the most thought out. Whitman claims, and I'm not sure whether he's telling the truth or not, because he was nothing if not a myth maker of himself. He claims to have seen Lincoln every night during the war as Lincoln rode out in the summertime, especially to Soldiers' Home, and to have bowed to him. And eventually, according to him, every time Lincoln saw Whitman, Lincoln bowed back. I'm not sure whether that's true, but I am certain that Whitman believed that Lincoln was a absolutely crucial democratic figure. And he, of course, becomes a famous poet when he writes the great elegies to Lincoln after Lincoln's assassination, especially Captain, My Captain, and When Lilacs Last at the Dooryard Bloomed. But Whitman was deeply influenced by Emerson, and in fact famously said, I was simmering, simmering, simmering. Emerson brought me to a boil. And he read Emerson's essay, The Poet, and he took that as a kind of mission statement, just as Thoreau had taken The American Scholar as a mission statement and had gone off to live at Walden. Whitman, for those of you who know Whitman's poetry, again, nothing in the world ever looked like that poetry up until that moment. It is crammed to the rafters with descriptions. The lines threaten to run off the end of the page. The lines go on for, at times, hundreds of words. There's no rhyme. There's a kind of rhythm, but it's an organic rhythm. It's not the kind of rhythm you get from counting syllables and figuring out where the stresses are. It's a free-flowing kind of poetry. And in 1855, when the first edition of Leaves of Grass comes out, Whitman tells his readers in the introduction what he's attempting to do. And what he's attempting to do is nothing less than to become the national poet. He says time and time again that the American poet is on the horizon. Now, why is this important, by the way? Poetry doesn't seem to be terribly important in the year 2012, as far as I know. It's not influencing presidential elections. It's not influencing economic policy. It's not even read that much anymore. In the 19th century, poetry was far and away the most important literary form available. It had the highest status of any literary form, certainly higher than the novel, which was looked at as a little middlebrow, and certainly higher than drama, which was considered low to middlebrow. Poetry was considered the most important genre of writing, and this, of course, is at a time when Americans did not have Facebook, did not have Twitter. I just read actually an account of somebody who's doing a dissertation on Twitter poetry. I'm glad that person's doing it, not me. But Twitter poetry apparently is poems that are written in 144 characters. Theater did not have the cachet that movies do now. There was obviously no television. Literature was the primary cultural outlet in 19th century America, and poetry was the most important form of that. And Whitman had an enormous Promethean ambition to become the most important poet of 19th century America. And in the introduction to Leaves of Grass, he says, I will become the American poet, and I will be the poet for everyone. And that's something that he attempts to do in Leaves of Grass. In Song of Myself, which is an 80 or so page poem, he attempts to chronicle everything he sees in the America of the mid-19th century. He crams in the sound of dock workers unloading cargo from other countries. He gets the sound of horses clip-clopping down the cobble streets of Broadway. He hears the sounds of pianos playing. He very deliberately talks about Yankees, Southerners, Westerners, Native Americans, African Americans. He tries to get the entire chaotic, dynamic, almost uncontrollable energy of the United States into his poems. And he says in that introduction, and in return, I, the American poet, will be embraced by the nation. He got the first part right, it seems to me. I mean, his poetry really does capture the 19th century pretty well. He was a little excessively hopeful about the second part. That is, I believe the first edition of Leaves of Grass sells Certainly under 500 copies. Yeah. The tragedy of the American artist. So what does he do? He puts out another edition in 1856, and a few more people read that. He starts to put out another edition in 1860, and the company that, the publishing house that's going to sponsor this goes under. And he nevertheless decides he's going to give it one more shot. He's going to try to get yet another version of Leaves of Grass published. And this version, unlike the previous two, is going to truly capture the American spirit in the way that has never been captured before. It's going to bring together the different sections. It's going to unify the nation. And right as he's beginning to work on what he calls the New American Bible, an artillery shell flies from Charleston to Fort Sumter, and very suddenly the United States is no longer the United States. It's two separate countries. So this man who had this strong desire to become the national poet suddenly has no nation to be the poet for any longer. And perhaps not surprisingly, he sinks into depression. And he tries to figure out what is he going to do in this new state of things, in this new world in which the great democratic experiment has seemingly failed. About a week or so after the war, he writes an interesting journal entry. And nobody knows exactly what he was thinking, but I have a little hypothesis. In the journal entry, he says something along the lines of, "I hereby forswear alcohol, meat, and other unhealthy foods." I have a hunch that he is at least thinking about, he's 41 years old at the time, he is at least thinking about enlisting, getting himself kind of in shape, and enlisting in the Union cause. He's certainly a staunch Unionist. He was opposed to slavery. He would have preferred for the nation to have come together, and if slavery had to exist, to let it exist. Like Lincoln early in the war, Whitman certainly valued union over emancipation. And in many ways, this would have been the chance to act out that dream of being immersed in the nation. He would have been participating in this incredibly important, the important event, perhaps, of American history. He doesn't do that, though. He doesn't explain why he doesn't do that. A couple of years later, a guy named Theodore Winthrop expresses disappointment that the so-called poet of democracy did not enlist, but he doesn't do that. The person who does it, who's close to Walt Whitman, is his brother, George Washington Whitman. He's a younger brother. He's a carpenter. He enlists within a week after the firing on Fort Sumter. He's one of the initial people to come up after Lincoln calls for recruits. George Washington Whitman will be in the war from the beginning to the end. He sees a number of major battles. He's at Antietam. He's at Chancellorsville. He is for a while imprisoned in a southern prison camp. He, in a unit that had, I believe, something like 500 people initially, he will be among the 60 or so people who survive. And one of his comrades said, "George, you're the luckiest man I ever knew." He was in one horrible battle after the other, and he survived. Now, after the war, when he comes home to Brooklyn, he's a wreck. He suffers what we would call post-traumatic stress disorder, but what was at the time known as either nostalgia or soldier's heart. But he goes through the entire war. And survives the war. And Walt, his older brother, writes letters to him, keeps in close correspondence with him as often as he can. But in December of 1862, Walt is sitting with his mother reading the morning newspaper. At this point, he has written a couple of propaganda-like poems about the Civil War. Beat Drums Beat is the most famous one, where he's essentially saying, come on, let's go Union. Let's defend the Union and restore the nation. But he hasn't done much else. He's written a couple of poems. On that morning, he looks at the newspaper and he sees the page that is bordered in black, which is where casualties from battles are listed. And he reads that George Washington Whitman has been injured at the Battle of Fredericksburg. A horrible battle. Parenthetically, I'll say, a horrible battle was Fredericksburg. Lincoln said about it after the battle, "If there is a worse place than hell, I am in it now." It was just it was a horrible Union defeat. Whitman reads that his brother is injured. He literally gets up from the table without finishing breakfast, and he races to the train, and he takes a train down to Washington, D.C., where he hopes that his brother has been transported to one of the many hospitals set up in the nation's capital. The first couple of days, Whitman goes from hospital to hospital. He asking, "Have you seen my brother?" And there, of course, he sees the aftermath of war. He sees the men who are extraordinarily sick from dysentery, the men who have lost limbs from amputation, but no one has seen his brother. I always think that poets are a little less than practical in a lot of ways, and one of the things about Whitman is he almost immediately is pickpocketed when he's in Washington, D.C., and I can just imagine that pickpocket going, there's the person I want to rob if I'm going to rob anybody. So he has no money. He's in Washington, D.C., a city he doesn't yet know. Going from hospital to hospital. One of the hospitals, incidentally, Louisa May Alcott is at, has just arrived, and the first men that she will nurse are actually from the Battle of Fredericksburg. He can't find George. He borrows some money, from whom we don't know. How much, we don't know, but he borrows enough money to take the train to Fredericksburg. And what he sees there astonishes him. The land is churned up from artillery fire. It's as though the ground has been plowed by cannon. There are these massive oak and maple trees surrounding the battlefield that look as though they've been cut down by what we would now think of as a chainsaw. They've just been shorn to the ground by the amount of firepower. There are dead horses everywhere, laying stiff-legged in the mud. And scattered all around the battlefield are little groups and clumps of men who have been injured but have not yet been transported either to the field hospital or by ambulance to Washington, D.C. Whitman has a little notebook with him, and he writes down, he sketches these things that he sees in this notebook. And very quickly he finds his brother. And that's a happy part of the story. His brother has been shot through the cheek, but is walking around cracking jokes. I think I would take to my sick bed for weeks if I'd been shot in the cheek. But George Washington Whitman is nothing if not a tough guy. And Whitman and his younger brother greet each other, have a tearful reunion, and then George Whitman says, "Let me introduce you to the folks that I've gotten to know in my company and elsewhere." And he literally takes him around to these different fellows. And Whitman diligently asks them questions. Where are you from? What battles have you seen? What surprised you most about military life? how have you been wounded? And he writes these things down in his notebook. And he spends the night with these guys and wakes up the next morning before they wake up. And he walks around a house that has been converted into a field hospital. And the first thing he sees that morning, he actually writes about numerous times as though he can't shake the memory of it. And what it is this a stack of refuse that's about this tall. He says it's a wagon load. It was 5 feet high. And as he approaches it, he realizes that it is a stack of limbs. He writes home about this. He writes about it in his memoirs. He writes about it in poems. He cannot get that memory out of his mind. But the other thing he sees shortly after that are 3 bodies. And they're right outside the field hospital. They've been laid side by side, and they have blankets draped over them. And staring at those bodies, he takes out his notebook and he writes what is his first real war poem. And if you will bear with me, I'd like to read that poem to you. It's a poem called A Sight in Camp in the Daybreak, Gray and Dim. And it begins with the speaker emerging so early sleepless, as slow I walk in the cool fresh air, the path near the hospital tent. And then the poem goes on to describe the 3 forms untended lying. Over each the blanket spread, ample, brownish, woolen blanket, gray and heavy blanket, folding, covering all. Curious, I halt and silent stand. Then, with light fingers, I from the face of the nearest, the first, just lift the blanket. Who are you, elderly man so gaunt and grim with well-grayed hair and flesh all sunken about the eyes? Who are you, my dear comrade? Then to the second I step, and who are you, my child and darling? Who are you, sweet boy, with cheeks yet blooming? Then to the third, a face nor child nor old, very calm, as of beautiful yellow-white ivory. Young man, I think I know you. I think this face is the face of the Christ himself, dead and divine and brother of all, and here again he lies. That's the first poem that Whitman writes after actually experiencing the Civil War up close and firsthand. Before that, the poems were beat, drums, beat. Married couples, be prepared for your husband to go fight. Churches, be prepared for your churches to be empty as men go and fight. It was kind of jingoistic, kind of propagandistic. Once he goes down to Fredericksburg and actually sees the realities of battle, he becomes a different poet. His writing is changed. It's chastened. No more does he make this grand pronouncement about, I will be the national poet. Rather, he decides that he will try to describe just what he sees without those kinds of pronouncements. And as you know, what Whitman did after visiting Fredericksburg was to change his home from Brooklyn to Washington, D.C., where, at great expense to his health, he spent the next couple of years tending to the injured who were in the various hospitals. And very, very famously, he, with very little money of his own, he would go and ask well-to-do folks for enough cash to enable him to buy things like candy, juice, stamps. He would sit by the young men, he would change their dressings, he would write letters for them if they were illiterate or incapacitated, he would feed them if they needed to be fed. But the point is that this almost grandiose sense of himself as the national poet changes, and he becomes much more chastened, much more hard-nosed and realistic, much more humble as a poet and as a person after that fact. Since we're here at the Lincoln Museum, I'd like to just close my talk with a little anecdote about American literature both before and after the Civil War. You may know that the best-selling book of the 19th century was Uncle Tom's Cabin. And you may know the great story, however apocryphal it actually is, of Lincoln saying to Harriet Beecher Stowe, "So you're the little lady who started this big war." That story is probably not true, but what is true is in many ways, Harriet Beecher Stowe, who also revered Emerson, tried to do what Emerson would call for in his essays, and that is, she wanted, as did Whitman and Thoreau and many other writers, to effect a moral revolution in the hearts of her readers. She didn't expect Uncle Tom's Cabin to just be entertainment. It wasn't the Jersey Shore of its day. It was meant to change the way you saw the world and meant to activate you into feeling sympathy for the slaves in a way that you never had before. The second most popular novel of the 19th century isn't read as often or as much as Uncle Tom's Cabin, and that's a book by Elizabeth Stuart Phelps called The Gates Ajar. And in The Gates Ajar, a young woman is suffering depression in 1865 because just before the Civil War ended, her beloved brother was killed in one of the final battles. And she sees no reason to continue. The toll of death during the period of the Civil War has so discouraged her, has given her such a pessimistic vision of human nature, and especially the death of her brother has so depressed her that she really is suicidal. But she has an aunt who comes out east to take care of her and who has a vision that she wants to share with the narrator of the book, this young woman. And that vision is that there is heaven. There is a heaven that is not just some place where the soul goes, but it is a heaven that looks exactly like the world we live in now, except better. And she gives all kinds of examples. The book, which is not a page turner, I will warn you, is essentially a long description of heaven. And she talks about the poor girl down the street, for example, who is a great piano player, but is too poor to afford a piano. When she dies, she's going to have her own grand piano. It's never winter in heaven. And you get the sense of heaven is the way the world looks now, except only better. And of course, the best part of it is that you become reunited with those that you've lost. This book was enormously popular in 1865 and 1866, and I don't think it takes Sigmund Freud to understand why that should be the case. It was enormously consoling after the nation had gone through 4 years of warfare to imagine that there was going to be a reunion with all those who had lost their lives afterwards. And the book closes with the aunt cheering up the depressed narrator by saying, "And do you know where your brother is right now? He's in heaven with all of the men in his company who lost their lives, and they're standing around Abraham Lincoln." That was the image that people needed to have in the aftermath of the Civil War. And both Whitman and Phelps, it seems to me, suggest a turn in American literature from that kind of brash, self-reliant, individualistic confidence to a more realistic and chastened view of human life. Thank you.